All right, hey everyone. This is episode 2 of What Library, and today I interview Rich Schneider. Oh man, this was a crazy episode. He's incredibly smart. Covered a whole bunch of topics very quickly. Just a quick intro. So Rich is an insanely productive research faculty at UCSF, studying evolution and the development of the skull and orthopedic facial phenotypes. He's also one of the most accomplished OA advocates in the UC system, which collectively publishes something like 10% of all research articles globally. So it's a massive university network. It's basically the size of another country, and he's been very involved in establishing OA policy and bringing the researchers' voice into those negotiations. So he led the charge as a faculty stakeholder in all of the most consequential UC negotiations with academic publishers over the last decade or two. So his work and approach to open access is interesting to me in that it synthesizes kind of equal parts fierce kind of idealism, like having this really strong kind of ideological, ethical, core, while also blending in very clear-eyed pragmatism and this sort of this urgency to act now on things that can actually be fixed today. So it's kind of a good mix of those two. So I really like talking with Rich. It's always a very inspiring conversation. So yeah, we barely scratched the surface on a lot. So I kind of feel like we just mapped out 10 different additional conversations we could have. So I don't know quite how to quickly summarize or introduce the conversation, other than to say we start out talking about how to create a quck, which is a cross between a duck and a quail, and we end with the future of research articles and libraries. So I wanted to just quickly define a few terms that come up, and I think one of these I actually kind of messed up myself while I was talking with Rich, but just to kind of level the playing field a little bit. So I'm sure you've heard of these, but I'll just kind of go over some of the basics. So green OA is a version of open access where the author accepted manuscript gets preserved in a university or otherwise public database. So basically, at time of publication, the publisher publishes it, and then the AAM, which is basically the unstyled, unformatted version of it, gets sent back to some sort of university or public repository. The AAM is the author accepted manuscript. And just in contrast to preprints are predominantly for pre-review. So basically before you submit it to a journal or at the same time you submit it to a journal. So Diamond Open Access is you don't pay to publish or to read. So it's just kind of a fee-free OA. Transformative agreements, or TAs, those are agreements that are structured to convert subscription-based journals through like kind of a hybrid process through to open access journals. So they're and typically you'll have like a big university system that will sign these with publishers to kind of transition things from subscription to APC-based or OA journals. And then this just came up very briefly, but the double dipping is this problem where in certain situations, journals can sometimes charge an author to make an article open access, but then they're also getting revenues from subscription fees for those same articles. So it's kind of this, you're basically charging for the same article twice. Okay, so yeah, that's my intro. So we'll get into it in just one second here. So today's episode is sponsored by LS2030. It is a library supplement designed by Alexandria Pharmaceuticals. The big shiny red pill is taken by leading librarians all over the world who are fearlessly shaping the future of preservation and universal access to our shared intellectual heritage. This is not your everyday supplement and should not be taken by individuals with a prior history of not giving a fuck. LS2030 offers long-lasting performance that penetrates deep into institutional stagnation. It produces, on average, 2 subscription cancellations per dose. Please contact your faculty if your subscription's budgets last longer than 2 years. LS2030 may cause elevated feelings of purpose and badassery, societal well-being, and in rare cases may cause a serious condition known as superarchival syndrome, or SAS, in which every digital object you open gets instantly preserved on thousands of different public repositories. Other side effects include getting fired, fierce optimism, pissing off your colleagues, anxiety followed by relief, existential peace, new friends, new enemies, delirium dreams, and changing the world. All right. And without further ado, this is Rich Schneider. Oh, recording. Okay, here we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, I got it. I'm going to do a recording here too, just in case. Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
No problem.
How have you been?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Good.
Hanging in there?
Hanging in there. Yeah.
You're in Southern California? Where are you?
I'm in San Diego. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. You kind of actually have the classic San Diego vibe going. It's good.
In what sense? Just the disheveled, just came from the beach?
Yeah, the beard just came from the beach, just got out of your wetsuit, and I got my in-law or my sister-in-law and brother-in-law lived down there, and we were just
nice. Do you surf at all next time you come down?
A little bit. My kids surf, so they do Bolinas and
Yeah. I've been meaning to surf the Bay Area for basically forever, and I just surfed there, I think last year. Cold as fuck, but it was really, really fun.
Yeah, it's pretty cold. Young kids have this resilience that as we get older we lose, and they can be in the water for hours and just seem to have no problem.
Yeah.
But no, things are good. Work's busy. I got a lot of really good science. You can see on the whiteboard there.
Is that your grand plan for the year?
Yeah, it's pretty much, I had all this stuff on the whiteboard for a year since the beginning of COVID with people who had left and projects and all this stuff. And then, and people come in my office and they look at it and they can see it hadn't changed. And then I was just like, all right, fuck this. And I just wiped everything clean. And I spent about 3 hours just thinking about all the stuff that we need to finish, that we're doing, and that I want to do, and mapped it all out. And so it's like projects, papers, revisions, manuscripts, things like that. I put initials. Made project lists. I put initials next to everybody's. Every project. People came in. They're someone came in earlier in the day and she saw that I was doing it, and she went left. She's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "God, you'll just wait." And then another person came later just to see what was happening, and eventually they all came in. And I'm like, nice. "Yeah, this is it. This is how we're going to work." So
nice, awesome.
And then the funny thing, I had my method, right? I had to get organized because there's just all this stuff spinning around. And then we had these seminar speakers come through. One from UCLA, and she just sat in this couch over here, and I was trying to talk to her, and the whole time she's looking at my whiteboard, and she's like, "That's awesome. I totally need to do something like this in my lab." She's like, I've got all this stuff just swirling around my brain. I don't know how to organize it. I just need to write it all down. She's like, "That's great."
But also what's also interesting about that is and I think about this a lot, is how do you reintroduce arbitrary constraints to keep yourself focused? The fact that there's just one whiteboard and there's limited space, it's different than your notes. I don't know what the notes app on your phone is, but it's just got thousands of notes.
Oh yeah, random shit like movies and restaurant reviews, plus let's try 10 micrograms per mil instead of 40 and see how that goes.
Yeah.
Just an idea that pops into my head. I'm like, oh yeah, we should just try a lower dose. So it's all kinds of random stuff. But we'll just ride with that. And I keep telling him, and I'm putting dates next to stuff for deadlines, and I keep telling my lab there's not that many boxes that are checked on my whiteboard yet.
Yeah. It's good motivation. Yeah, that's actually working from home. That's one of the things I miss, is just having access to huge whiteboards, especially on campus, and there's just a hallway with whiteboards. You could just really vomit all of your thoughts out onto that.
For sure.
Yeah. So
Yeah, thanks for I thought the first email was like disappearing ink. I put lemon juice on it. I was trying to like figure out how do I read it.
I cannot believe that happened. I still
Yeah,
don't know how it happened. I think I sent it at night, and I think my phone was in dark mode, and somehow Gmail
right.
sent it, but like only half of it. Yeah, so I sent Rich an email. Basically,
And so I just kind of
like,
looked
hey, what we're
over the
talking about today,
thing
and it
and
was half in white font. So he was like, "What the hell is this guy talking about?"
yeah, and
Although,
yeah, so how you been staying busy?
how about I was saying? So I am at the middle phase with your whiteboard conversation where you wiped everything clean.
Yeah.
I wiped everything clean, and I'm now trying to add stuff back on my whiteboard. But I'm in kind of an interesting spot, and which is kind of what motivated this podcast. I've so well right now I have a day job, right? So I have a day job at UCLA. I'm, ostensibly I'm building, software for researchers and for a campus at UCLA.
Okay.
Very fun. Love everyone I work with there. It's kind of a day job, but yeah, that's all great. So that keeps me somewhat busy.
And what department is that in, or how are you hired?
It's a staff department, so it's we work a lot with faculty, but it's an Office of Advanced Research Computing at UCLA.
Okay.
So it's
Yeah,
basically a bunch of staff, and we just do research support basically.
great.
And I am kind of transitioning for my Skullcom work. So I was really engaged with everything, both volunteer stuff, which we worked on together a bit, and but also trying to get the micropublication workflows going, and just running into a lot of walls, both. But funding wise, it's always hard to fund these things. There's not a lot of money for these sorts of things. But also just on a deeper conceptual level, I just found myself like not fighting against people, but just like there was not synergy and like, oh yeah, we're all on the same page here. And so
Right.
I'm in sort of this like, sort of almost Zen moment where I'm trying to just be like, okay, this is not a thing that you can stubborn your way through, which I am good at. If it is a problem, you need to stubborn your way through. But there's obviously, Stalcom is a very complicated issue. And so,
Sure.
yeah, so I'm kind of coming to terms both with the idea that micropublications, while very exciting, is a very long-term concept that's going to just take a lot of energy to kind of get off the ground. And
Right.
it also just is going to require this like longer term horizon. So I'm kind of figuring out how to keep working on that in a much more like low resource setting way, and then be more opportunistic about it. And so I'm still doing work with micropublications, but we're kind of like rebuilding kind of the whole concept and kind of figuring out where we're going to strike next, sort of thing. So
Yeah.
uh, and then I also have two young kids that are also keeping me busy too. So
Yeah. No, for I can imagine.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, no, I always wondered how the micropub thing was going to work out. Of course, I'm big fan of all kinds of innovations
Mhm.
in Skullcom, but there's something. Let me just turn off my thing here. There's something really uh, functionally relevant about a regular size publication, right? Like as a unit
Yeah,
of
yeah.
as a unit of kind of like
You just kind of
engagement,
get for the
interaction.
consumption of it, the sharing of it. Yeah. And
Yeah. And a
yeah.
micro version of it, I mean, in many ways, it's kind of like a song, right? Like,
Mhm.
you know, would the world benefit if we broke songs down just into ringtones or
Yeah. Oh my God. I love that analogy. I should stick with that. So yeah. So let me just add one thing in there before I say
sure.
extend the analogy. Yeah. So basically, I always knew that the breaking down part was the easy part. The hard part is the building it back up. And if you can't build it back up into a meaningful way to digest it, then you're lost. And so that's kind of that's where the real opportunity, but also real challenge is. And so yeah, so I think to extend your analogy, yeah, you have to get back to a song, right? Like, who the hell wants to listen to like a 2 second, like, even if it's
Ring,
beautiful harmony, it's like, what the hell is this? So I
right,
guess the example would be like a drum circle or something. It's like to get back to the song, you need those random clips to like you basically
right.
need people, right? So you need to get back to a narrative,
Yeah,
but where I'm trying to push it is to get back to a community driven narrative. So you're not having one person singing by themselves, but you're having like, hey, I'm like beating this drum, like come on over, like it's
right,
gonna be great. Just trust me, it's gonna be great. So I haven't gotten there yet, but
right.
that's the idea.
Well, and the reason why I bring, because you asked me this question in this great list of questions about where do I see kind of science and libraries going or scientific Scalcom or whatever. And it's just like, I'm trying to think, everyone's talking about data and that's great. Everyone needs access to data. And then everyone's talking about, papers being deconstructed into figures and putting them in places like Figshare and sharing all of that. And of course, that's great. No one's opposed to sharing the components of a paper. But at the end of the day, like as an academic pursuit, writing a paper is a beautiful thing, right? It's a
Yeah.
story. It's like creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like a whole act of creating a narrative,
Hmm.
illustrating it, telling a story about um, observations that you've made and the way that you've tested things, or just regardless of the discipline. Like there's a
Yeah.
whole kind of academic process and this method of inquiry that
Hmm.
a paper encapsulates. And on some level I don't really understand what would replace that, or why we even need to, because
Yeah.
um
If
it
there's something like
yeah,
anything that can withstand the like craziness of going from like print to digital, like this whole like
for sure.
so computers, internet, and it survived all of that. I mean, so there's
Yeah,
something very beautiful about just a document like or like a format like persisting for that long through so much. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, like if it would have, there's all the ingredients for that to be disrupted if it was going to be disrupted. And yeah, and so I sort of see where the other kind of shift in my thinking has been really seeing like books, articles, so like monographs, articles, and micropubs as like three different kind of like pillars. And like if the most wildly successful version of micropubs, in my mind, would not compete directly with articles. They would be something that would like be this weird, more like rapid, like immediate stage
sure.
that could get to truth or whatever, but you would still want, and I mean, even in terms of like interface design and workflow design, I've thought about how do you then transition to the article. And so, and maybe I can ask you this later, but I do have this thought of trying to have articles be kind of a little bit more like having more review articles so that you're allowed to have that rapid communication happen, and then the research article that a little bit slower takes a little longer, a little bit more, so it can be more like lean a little bit more towards review where you're able to incorporate either preprints or micropubs or whatever it is with some either original analysis or maybe some other original data as well.
Mhm.
But can we actually just step back for a
Yeah,
sec?
sure.
I wanted you to just give a little spiel about like your before like the non-Scalcom stuff. So
Sure.
like what's your background? Like what got you
Yeah.
into research and all that stuff?
Yeah, sure. It depends on how far back you want to go. I mean, like really
When I was
started.
5 years old.
Yeah.
No,
No,
I'm kidding.
when I really started, I like thinking about what it would be like to be an adult, if that is even ever possible. But I was um in college. I went to college to be creative writer, musician, studied poetry,
Mm,
undergraduate,
mm,
in literature. And it wasn't until I took a really transformative class. You hear these stories all the time where you meet a great teacher. I met a great teacher,
mm,
this guy named Ray Coppinger at Hampshire College. He was teaching a course on animal behavior, and I got really interested in evolution of dogs, skulls, and wolves and coyotes, and just the shape of the skull and how that changes
mm,
over time.
mm,
And I had been reading Goethe, and there's this alas poor Ulrich kind of idea of like, Goethe discovers a skull and he comes up with this vertebral theory of the evolution of the skull, that the skull is
mm,
basically just an extension of the vertebral bodies, and totally um conceptual and so on. But like I was just really intrigued by that, and I love that kind of like the evolution of the head and the skull kind of brought literature and science together. And I also had gotten really tired of kind of the way that literature was being approached as an
mm,
undergraduate, in terms of like thinking about all kinds of ways of analyzing the text without actually really paying attention to language and the metaphors and the simile. Like I was really interested in language as an art form and not
mm,
necessarily as like critical theory. So I kind of stemmed towards science, and I realized I wanted to do science. I really liked the kind of objectivity, or at least what I thought at the time was much more objective compared to literary stuff that was way more subjective. And so I thought, well, I need some more experience. And I remember walking down the hallway one day and finding a bulletin board that had, back then there wasn't stuff on the internet. This was like early BitNet days, like really early terminal interactions with the internet. When I was an undergraduate, like in the late, mid to late 80s. And I tore a little tag off of a promotional poster for internships at the Smithsonian. It was like literally like you pull this thing off and then you send it in and you get an application. Applied for this internship at the vertebrate zoology department at the Smithsonian. I got this internship. So then I spent a bunch of months at the Smithsonian just
Were you
surrounded by
still were you
I
still,
was
so
still
you're,
an undergraduate.
yeah, but and you were still, your major was still liberal arts or, and
No,
you,
at that point, so where I was at Hampshire, we didn't really have majors. You have
oh,
like you do a division ones in 4 schools, and you do division two, which is your concentration, then you do a division three, which is basically like a senior thesis. And I did
okay. Oh,
that.
that's cool.
Yeah. So my division two is on scientific and literary traditions, where I pretty much read everything that was in the canon, plus lots of stuff that was out of the canon. And then for my division three, I did this comparative evolution and anatomy development of the skull in a bunch of different in dogs, wolves, coyotes, jackals, as well as a bunch of different other mammals, ground squirrels. And I just really got fascinated in evolution and development and developmental biology. And so then after that internship, I decided I wanted to go to grad school, applied to a bunch of grad schools, end up going to Duke, where I got my master's and my PhD there, studying comparative evolution, comparative anatomy, comparative development of the head, and started doing transplants and all kinds of embryological experiments in birds. And then I came to UCSF to do a postdoc. For my PhD, I had generated these embryological fate maps where you like take either label or do transplants in the embryo. I figured out where all the bones of the face come from.
Oh, okay.
Part of my PhD,
Oh, cool.
and I made a map for that. And then I got to San Francisco, and I was learning a lot more molecular biology in a lab here at UCSF on Parnassus, and I would oftentimes just walk down and get on the Anjuta, which is the train line, and just
Oh, yeah.
head out to the beach just to kind of clear my head and hang out and just kind
Oh,
of
man,
look
I
at the
love Ocean
sunset.
Beach. I love
Yeah,
it over
it's
there.
awesome, and just watch people surfing or whatever. And I was down there one day, and I was watching all these brown pelicans fly by, and I just saw these like giant beaks, and I was like,
Yeah.
wow, there's got to be a way that I could figure out how those beaks, like how do they build beaks that are so big? Where do the cells get the information? What makes a big beak like that? And because I had done all this work as a PhD student, I realized I could maybe use my background to try and solve this problem. So I um I contacted some folks, tried to get brown pelican eggs. That didn't really pan out, but I was able, because San Francisco has the largest Chinatown outside of Asia, I was able to find a commercial supplier of white Peking duck
Oh,
and
interesting.
Japanese quail, and I started this like chimeric transplant system when I set up
Those
my
species, you gave up on the
yeah, I
pelican.
gave up on the brown pelicans, but I started doing these transplant experiments in quail and duck embryos, transplanting these precursor cells that give rise to the beak skeleton from quail into duck. And I made these things that I called quuck, which is a duck with a quail's beak. And
Yeah.
it's QUCK. I thought the world needed another UCK word. So
Yeah.
created the quuck.
Yeah.
And yeah, these are these duck embryos that have quail beaks, and then we make the dwale, which is the quail host with the duck donor cells. And the whole idea is to use that as a screen to figure out what are the genes, what are the critical signaling interactions that allow a species to form a face that is
Wait, so
specific.
why did you need to do the chimera to achieve that?
Because you need to be able to take a
To kind of
population.
isolate it?
Yeah, and see, first of all, where are the cells that are mediating that species specific anatomy. And
Okay.
second, by mixing them, you can really see the extent to which a complex biological process like building three-dimensional anatomy is either cell autonomous
Oh, got it.
or an
Okay.
emergent property from,
Yeah.
you
So
know,
when you
kind of
get the duck bill on the quail, then
when you get the duck bill on the quail or the quail's beak on the
yeah,
duck, you know it's the cells you transplanted.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then you can look at how the host responds and how you get gene expression changes mediated by the donor cells and so on and so forth. So anyway, that was like a, for me, doing that experiment, I sent that work off to Science. It got accepted. And so that paper was just me and my postdoctoral advisor. But that enabled me to more or less open a door that
Yeah.
might not have opened had I not done that kind of experiment and gotten that kind of publicity out of it.
Yeah,
And
can you actually pause and as we kind
yeah,
of transition to some of the publishing stuff, just, because some of the listeners might
yeah,
not, researchers, or kind of really deeply understand how critical that experience can be in the career and why, like,
absolutely.
'cause it really explains like some of the behavior on the research side. Can you just
Yeah.
explain what that does for you as a researcher when you get that
Yeah,
kind of paper.
for sure. I mean, I'm confident that that paper, basically you do an experiment and you kind of know right away whether
Like cool shit.
it's if it's really cool or not. And the kind of transplants I was doing, by the way, had been done in the 1920s and 30s in amphibians.
Mm.
Hans Spemann and Hilde Mangel had done these experiments in Germany, and of course Hans Spemann won the Nobel Prize for that by transplanting parts between amphibians. I more or less did the same thing, but the insight that my work showed were donor-mediated changes in gene expression, that the way that you transformed one species into another was by having the donor cells differentially control the expression of the host. And so that major insight meant that was a new insight, and that's what allowed that paper to get published by Science. So, I could have sent that to a specialty journal, but I sent it to Science, and that paper getting accepted got a lot of publicity. There was on New York Times, BBC, it was everywhere, Canadian Broadcasting. I mean, like that, it got picked up. I got interviewed by Vice magazine. There's a really, really funny interview that's from way back in the day that I should send you sometime.
Okay.
From Vice. It's really dark and really funny. Those guys hit the nail on the head with that. And but the impact of something like that, I had an RO3 award from the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research because I was really interested in understanding how the face gets patterned, which has huge implications for just understanding how birth defects form, how you get symmetry on the face, how you get fusion of the developing primordia of the face so that you don't get clefting defects. So the NIH funded the work, and it would allow me, with a paper of such a high impact like that, allowed me then to turn that smaller grant into a much larger grant, an RO1 award, where I said I was going to use this quail duck system to more or less reverse engineer how you build a head and how you do things like integrate the muscles and the bones and the cartilage and how you control the differentiation. So huge implications for how we understand the way that you build really complex three-dimensional structures over time.
So did you apply for a faculty position at UCSF at the same time that you got the R? Like, what was that?
Yeah. So then what happened was I actually started looking for jobs at the end of my postdoc. I came to UCSF in 1998, and I was doing this work 2001, 2002. This paper came out in 2003. And I started applying for jobs, and I had a job offer elsewhere. And the chairman of my current department, he was walking through the lab one day, and he's like, "I hear you're thinking of going somewhere." And I was like, "Well," he's like, "How do we get you to stay?" And I was like, here's my offer letter, make me a counter offer. And he did. And I loved UCSF. I mean, it's an amazing place. There's just so many great people, and the community. It's very collaborative and collegial, and
awesome.
it's extremely rigorous but not competitive, and it's a great uplifting environment. And so and it also stands for You Can Stay Forever, UCSF. And so I stayed, and
because Harvard, like some of those schools, they like have this like ticking clock, and they basically boot you out no matter how successful you are, right?
No, this place does a really good job of nurturing people and making you feel supported and welcomed. And so I stayed, and I set up my own lab. I started as an adjunct faculty member, and then in 2003 I got what we call an in-residence appointment, with the promise of switching to another academic title or a series if I got an RO1. So they kind of incentivize you. My chairman at least did a good job of incentivizing me to keep working harder and harder. And then so 2003 kind of was when my official faculty appointment started. And as part of that, I had to become a contributing member to the community in ways beyond just doing my own research. Once you kind of get in a faculty track, you have to start checking boxes for doing different things around service, and teaching and so on and so forth. And so
So
when it
did
came,
that kind of is that kind of what led into your Skullcom kind
yeah,
of?
so I'm looking at the list. The Academic Senate sends out a call for service every year, and the UC Academic Senate, I didn't really learn this until I got deep into it, but the UC Academic Senate is an extremely special place among academic institutions worldwide. We have a system here in UC called shared governance, where the faculty are really part of the administration of the university, not administration as an administrator, but like really in terms of consultation and engagement with university president's office and so on. And so I'm looking at this list of of potential opportunities, and there's like committee on advancements and promotions, research committee. There's over a dozen or so committees, and I saw this committee on library, and I was like, okay, that seems like a pretty easy gig.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I'll do that. And plus, I've always had a fondness for librarians. I was actually in a former life married to one when I was in grad school, and she was a master of science and library science at UNC Chapel Hill while I was at Duke. And so I always hung out with librarians. I like the way librarians think. And I always, I love being in a library. I love being in stacks of books and just like pulling stuff off the shelf, and just that whole discovery process of looking for one thing and then finding 100 others, and like spending hours in the library. There's something that I felt like an extremely comfortable place. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go serve on the committee on library, which was had as its charge to support and consult on the library of issues related to space and money, more or less. That's kind of what the charge was. And so I started doing that, and it really was about space and money. Initially, it was like about how do we make sure the library has enough space for books, and how do we make sure the library has enough resources. And in 2003, 2004, when I first started working on the library committee at UCSF, I mean, it was an extremely exciting time for scholarly communications, right? I didn't learn this, and I didn't really know about this too much until I got on the committee, but the PLOS journals were just coming online. So PLOS Genetics, PLOS Medicine, PLOS Biology had just come online, PLOS itself. And there were a lot of UC faculty involved, Harold Varmus and Mike Eisen and others, Pat Brown of Stanford, they're all involved. So there's a lot of that going on at UC. Had just been like the Berlin Open Access meeting. So a lot of this stuff was kind of filtering through into the library committee. And so I started paying attention to it. I got really excited about this idea that scholarly communication could actually change, and that we as authors and researchers, faculty, could make a difference. And so I started kind of focusing on that a little bit. The thing about the academic senate is, and I guess this is a lesson too late, but as soon as you show any interest and show any like passion about an issue, like they keep hitting you up for more stuff.
Okay, so, we got Rich on that.
Yeah. So, so I wound up, I think like I wound up being chair of that local committee for 10 years. I was on it for like 10 years. I was like, I don't remember how many years, 3 years as chair, 3 years as vice chair.
Yeah.
But then they also tapped me to go to the system-wide committee. And system-wide is where all 10 UC campuses each send a representative.
Yeah.
And then you deal with issues on a much larger scale. And so I was the UCSF representative to Academic Senate Committee on Library.
Okay.
And initially, and I became chair of that for 4 years and another year as chair, which just introduced me to all kinds of people. And once you're running these committees as chair, you have to then do these other obligations. So I started interacting a lot more with folks at the highest levels in the library. And so one of the things early on, working with a guy named Ben Crow, who was a faculty member, he was the chair of the system-wide library committee when I first got there. Mm-hmm. He was a faculty member from UC Santa Cruz, and the Santa Cruz Academic Senate passed what I think might have been the very first open access policy. I think maybe like around 2005.
Oh, that's super early. Yeah.
Or 2008. And it was like a Senate resolution of this UC Santa Cruz, and he was really excited. And so Ben and I and a couple other folks worked really hard to expand the charge of the Committee on Library, the system-wide, to include scholarly communication.
Okay.
So it became the Committee on Library. It transformed from the UC Committee on Library to the UC Committee on Library and Scholarly Communication.
Yeah.
And then I went back to UCSF and we changed, and I advocated to change the committee on the local campus level from library to library and scholarly communication. So to broaden our mission. And that would allow us then to take on these larger issues, not only advise the university and the library on issues regarding space and money, but also any issue relating to scholarship.
Because it's so integral, especially once you start talking about OA policy. Now you have this big like
That's
ball
right.
flags.
And so we kind of enabled ourselves to take on, like purposefully enabled ourselves to take on these larger issues by broadening the charge of our committee. And so we worked really hard to take the UC Santa Cruz open access policy. We worked with the system-wide library and scholarly communication committee, SLASIAC, which I still to this day I think is one of the worst acronyms in the entire UC system. SLASIAC. Just sit on that for a second.
Oh man.
Right. Every time I hear it, I think of like
lazy? Are they sleazy? What are they?
Sleestacks and Land of the Lost, but SLASIAC. And I served on SLASIAC. It's an awesome committee because it brings library and faculty and Office of the President, high level administrators together to think about scholarly communications. And so SLASIAC, with input from authors and from the Senate and others, came up with this open access policy that they first passed, or we tried to pass. We all wrote, we all brought it back to our local campuses and advocated for it. The first UC open access policy was like this thick, right? This is like 2007 or so. And UCSF, I wrote the response for UCSF, and it was a really positive response. Like, we want this to happen. We think it's great. But lots of other campuses pushed back. They felt like it was extremely onerous. The burden was on faculty. You had to engage with individual publishers to secure your rights, when we were all currently at that time doing copyright transfer agreements for subscription content. There were lots of problems. There, wasn't really clear about the legal issues, and you had to opt in and all this kind of stuff. And so it didn't really do well, but it stirred the pot quite a bit. It got a lot of us thinking.
Started the conversation, basically.
And it got us really excited about the potential of having an institutional open access policy to make our work freely available. And it was really following what was happening with the Bethesda, PubMed Central, Bethesda Open Access, and then Berlin and so on. This idea that like institutions really needed to step up. The way that we could tip the balance of publishing from subscription to open was to more or less use the weight of funders, use the weight of institutions to kind of push this whole system down a different path. And so the open access policy, we're supposed to do that. So it didn't really pass. And what's interesting is that Harvard and MIT kind of really studied what UC did and how we failed. And
to tweak and try.
And they tweaked it, and they made, they had some really important contributions to this. One of the things is they kind of made it opt out. Everyone was opting in. Everyone was part of the in-group by passing a policy, meaning as kind of like a condition of your employment as a faculty member, you were already part of the in-group. You had to opt out if you didn't want to do it. And so Harvard and MIT, they developed, this model template and policy that was really adopted. In fact, it's been said that, UC's kind of mistake was Harvard's lesson learned, and they came up with this great policy, which has been hugely effective. And then in 2012, I was still, or 2011, I was still chair of UCALASC, and I realized that the only way that we were going to get an open access policy in the UC system was to have kind of like a canary in the coal mine, like to have a campus take this on. And so I went back to the UCSF local committee, and I wrote an open access policy for UCSF. And then I spent a whole year as chair of that committee going to.
What year was this again? Just to kind of.
It was 2011, 2012.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
2012.
Around there. Yeah. That's
And
right.
so then I went around to all like every Senate meeting. I must have talked to easily 500 faculty, going to every single academic senate, getting endorsement, answering questions,
Yeah.
really making it about the profit margins of the commercial publishers, and how we the life cycle of the scholarly article, where we come up with the ideas and we generate the preliminary data, we get the grants, we mentor the students, we write the papers, we submit them to our colleagues who are editors, who send them to other colleagues who are peer reviewers, and then a paper gets
None of which are
revised.
paid. Yeah. At this point.
Right.
Yeah.
None of this is paid, and the only payment so far has been like the sweat, the work that's gone into it, and then we do all this stuff, revise the paper, send it back. It gets second rounds of revision. Then the editor has to make a decision, write up the review, and then it gets accepted. The publisher takes it. They say thank you very much. They put their imprint on it, and then they make $40 billion a year. And we have to spend all this money to get the papers back from the paywall. And the idea that there's just profit margins that are exceeding those of Apple and Google and all that resonated really well with my colleagues, especially at a time when we were all being furloughed. The
There was
economy was
Yeah.
collapsing. And so we're like, why are the publishers making 40% profit margins, 38,
Yeah.
40% profit margins? We're
So
doing.
at that moment, because one of the things that I've kind of been recently thinking about, but at that moment when this was basically kind of right as this like the OI movement was really starting to get traction. There was movement, actual behavioral movement, people basically like publishing more in open access journals and basically pushing this shift, this like decades long shift to OA. What was your thinking at that moment in terms of the potential like risks of cost inflation of APCs, or was it just like, I mean,
No.
obviously, like I definitely have the opinion that obviously I
Oh,
kind of prefer OA
yeah.
to subscription, but like we're now dealing with some other issues. So like, was it just like, okay, we'll deal with that when we get to it, or is there
Yeah,
like,
no. So what happened, that we weren't even thinking about APCs. There were these journals like PLOS and a bunch of Biomed Central and other titles that were out there that were charging APCs. They were on an APC model. What we
yeah,
were doing back in 2011, 2012 was really just a green OA. We wanted to make institutional repositories. So my
okay, sorry,
my
I
my
misheard. Okay,
thinking back then was like, the first thing and I was motivated for a slightly different reason. So what I was thinking back then is like that the publishing system was this three-legged chair, right? There's the kind of the subscription system that holds up one leg. There's the copyright piece that allows more or less the subscription system to stand, because without that, losing copyright, an author writes a manuscript, you spend all this time writing a manuscript, and then at the end of it,
yeah,
you have to transfer your copyright to the commercial
yeah,
publisher. You don't have to, but they required it as a condition for publishing. And
yeah,
that never made sense to me. Like, I never understood why we had to do that. By that time, I was married to a woman who was a commercial photographer, and she was licensing her work to everywhere. But when she took a picture, she always owned the copyright.
yeah,
And I had
yeah,
friends that were musicians, and they owned the copyright to their work, and they licensed the use of that work. And I
yeah.
never understood why we had to transfer a copyright to the publisher, why we couldn't just keep our copyright. And so one of the biggest things that attracted me to open access, alongside the fact that all of my work would be freely available, was the fact that I, as an author, got to retain copyright. And I can come back to that later, because that's actually something that I've really been focused on right now in a slightly
Yeah,
different.
I would love to come back to that because I feel like where a lot of this is going is my mind is disentangling prestige services from publishers and basically copyright retention and like the
Yeah.
actual like academic stewardship of the content and like disentangling that,
Yeah.
because one of the walls that I hit is I just was very like got really riled up about both subscriptions and APCs, and I have been kind of going through this like transition where if you really see like the commercial publishers as prestige services and you like lop off their fingers in terms of like being stewards of the content, like as an academic scholarly thing, then it's kind of fine. Like, okay, whatever, you want to go pay $10,000 APC to get the prestige and get the publicity, like that's kind of fine. Like as long as the content is being handled. So I kind of am like almost
Yeah.
returning to this like the green OA sort of style where it's like separating the two in a really clear way. But let's come back to
Yeah,
that.
we'll come back to that, because
Yeah,
that, by the way, back then, the copyright issues, they don't really resonate. What really resonated with my colleagues, my faculty colleagues, was the money. And what had happened was like about a year prior to that, when I was still chair of UCSF, the University Committee on Library and Scholarly Communications, Nature Publishing Group decided that they were going to raise our subscription rate by 300% in 1 year. Okay.
Oh, fuck off. Are
So
you serious?
yeah,
They did
this
a
was
3x in 1 year?
yeah. So it was pretty amazing. And so I happened to be chair of
Are you
UClass, and this
serious?
was like, it was perfect. So this gave us an opportunity
Oh, man.
to engage with the publisher in a way that we had never really engaged with them before.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Nature, they were great. The folks that we worked with from Nature, they were awesome. And so Keith Yamamoto, who is a UCSF faculty member, and I, along with Ivy Anderson, who negotiated all the contracts for the California Digital Library, the three of us engaged with a group from Nature Publishing Group, kind of like their senior leadership at the Nature Publishing Group.
Mhm.
And we spent like almost a year negotiating with them, not just, the fact that this 300% increase was kind of rude and insensitive and like poorly timed, to say the least,
Yeah.
given the financial situation at the UC. But it was an opportunity to really talk about, like, well, if we were to build a scholarly communication ecosystem from scratch, what would it look like? We talked about open access, we talked about author rights, but you can go back and look. There are all these letters. So we threatened to boycott. Right. The only way that I went around and I met again with like dozens of UCSF campus and system-wide committees, presented about what Nature was doing, what was wrong with scholarly communications more broadly, how this fit right in. It got international press. There's all kinds of stuff about UC's boycott against the Nature Publishing Group, or threatened boycott, which, by the way, Keith and Peter Walter at UCSF had led very successfully a similar boycott against Elsevier when they bought Cell Press. They also wanted to raise the subscription rate for UC, and so Peter and Keith launched kind of a boycott against Cell Press titles and against Elsevier.
And when you say boycott, you mean like on the researcher side, where they just weren't going to review?
They weren't going to write
or the
for
library side, pushing them to drop the subscription.
Correct. Well, in terms of the library side, on the Nature thing, our subscription was like, we weren't willing to renew it. But we also backed that with faculty commitment to not review for these journals,
so double
publish in these journals, not submit job advertisements. Back then, by the way, that's how you recruited faculty, was you posted positions in science and nature. And so, there's a lot of ad revenue and things like that, and so we committed as an institution to not do those things for these journals. And UC publishes 12% of all content in Nature, right?
Wow, that's so such a huge platform,
right? So we had an impact, and so we wrote this letter. Nature wrote a response. Then we wrote a response to their response. It's all in the press. It's actually really fun to go back and look at that kind of stuff and see that. So that got me got me thinking about what we were doing, in 2010. It also made me recognize the value of using the financial or economic features of the dysfunction in the scholarly communication ecosystem as kind of like a way to get faculty to start thinking seriously about this. And they're free.
And again, so you're referring to that this event, which was this 3x of the thing, and you basically use that to start the conversation. It kind of gets people's attention, and then
right, exactly. And then I knew which people were interested in engaged on these issues. And so then when it came time, we went from the Nature boycott to the open access policy. UCSF, when it passed its open access policy, it's like one of my proudest days as a faculty member. I remember going around like to all my colleagues and in their office at lunch, like, come down and vote. We had an in-person vote on campus. And, I was told it was the largest in-person vote, the largest vote on any UCSF issue. Awesome. And it was unanimous. Right. And I got up there in front of all these faculty colleagues and explained to them why we were doing it, what we're doing. It was thrilling. It was amazing. And so that just like made me recognize like that if you focus on one thing, and you figure out all the ways that you can advocate for that one thing rather than, a lot of us do so many different things, but by really focusing on open access policy,
Yeah.
um, I recognized that if I could get it to pass at UCSF, and it did for a year, and we worked with Catherine Mitchell at the CDL to build infrastructure through a repository called eScholarship, so our authors
So
can
was that policy the one that you just were talking about? Was that also kind of green OA focused, or what was the
It was
like the
all
life
green. So there
of
were
that?
two parts to it. One, which is that our authors grant a pre-existing non-exclusive license to the regents of the University of California. So as an author, as a condition of my employment, when I write a paper, as soon as it's finished, or even as I'm writing it, whatever manuscript form it's in, there's a pre-existing license that I have granted, non-exclusive license to the regents. So that
Yeah.
when the publisher comes along and says, hey, we want you to transfer copyright, I don't really have all the rights to that. I've already
Yeah.
granted non-exclusive rights. I can't give the publisher an exclusive right. So that was the copyright piece. And then the second piece is that not only am I going to grant this pre-existing non-exclusive license to my institution, but I'm also going to commit to take that work in my final author's version, the
Yeah.
author's final version, what we call the author accepted manuscript,
Yeah, the
the
AAM.
AAM,
Yeah.
and put that in a green open access repository. And by this point, there were a couple hundred institutions that had already done this in Europe. Certainly Harvard and MIT had built DSpace. There were repositories, there were places that were doing this at this point. And so eScholarship became the central repository for the open access policy, first at UCSF, and we built infrastructure to allow manuscript deposit. And then I went back to system-wide and worked with the chair there. It's got Chris Kelty from UCLA, and we developed a system-wide open access policy. We were getting very little waiver requests by publishers at UCSF. There were no dire consequences for our authors. There wasn't a huge work increase for our authors. We had designed the policy and the implementation in ways that made the burden on faculty very minimal. That was a concern of some of our Senate committees. But we worked really hard to create a policy that just did what we needed it to do, which was allow our work to become freely available and allow authors to also control some of the rights to their work. And then it passed system-wide. And then after that, we worked to develop a system-wide presidential policy. And so that kind of then set the entire UC system with these open access policies that would allow the UC system theoretically to publish 50,000 articles a year open access. Just think about that for a second. It's like the UC system generates about 50,000 peer-reviewed scholarly articles every year, which is like the size of several European countries.
Yeah. Yeah. It's huge.
And so that was kind of like a way of kind of getting into green OA. But it had some limitations, right? It was dependent upon authors submitting their manuscripts to the repository to make them open access, which a lot of our authors just weren't doing. So Catherine and her team, with a lot of input from the Senate committees, developed kind of auto harvesting to get manuscript, get papers, but realizing that in fact, at the same time that we had these open access policies and we were talking about open access, our libraries were still sending millions and millions of dollars, like $40 million a year, to the commercial publishers in the form of subscriptions. And so I started really asking my local librarian, like, why don't we just cancel subscriptions and give all that money to our authors? Or this idea that somehow we needed to put our money where our mouth was, and stop paying subscriptions and take our money, which is what the publishers they just didn't need our content, they also needed our money.
Yeah. Hold on. So I kind of feel like we're transitioning into the more recent negotiations, but before we go there, just kind of as you were talking about the green OA policy and specifically the user experience of that and the authors not wanting to deposit in the green OA, that being a point of like the restriction there, right? So that you weren't getting the engagement you wanted. How does that dovetail with the rise of preprints? And I'm not sure where the time, because I know preprints were maybe a little bit later than that. They were more like
preprints were later. Absolutely.
But like in a way, do you see preprints as sort of like a weird amalgamation of like a more user incentivized Greenaway. I know it's not the same, and I think I would probably prefer the Greenaway infrastructure. There's better
Mhm.
infrastructure there, but how did you see? They're kind of like almost in overlapping spaces a little bit.
Yeah, no, well, okay. So I would argue, I mean, the data would probably show that like preprints had more or less the same kind of uptake as green institutional open
Oh,
access
really?
pods
Okay,
in the
that's
beginning.
yeah. It's still yeah.
And it wasn't until the NIH put out a call for comments on considering preprints as evidence of productivity on federally funded projects, on progress reports, and so on. And that was, let me just see when that was. I'm not exactly sure when that was, but
That was
oh,
yeah.
that
I
was
remember that though.
2017.
Oh,
2017.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I wrote for
That's
UCSF, I wrote an institutional response with some other folks that basically said, yes, this is going to be a game changer. As soon as the NIH
yeah.
says that preprints are evidence of productivity on progress reports and
Yeah.
federally funded awards, it
Yeah.
will change the entire system of incentives for preprints. Okay.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you look at the deposit rates over time for NIH for preprints in like
Uh-huh.
in archive or not archive, but bioarchive.
Yeah. Bioarchive. Yeah.
Yeah, archive kind of had its own culture and behavior that's kind of independent, but
Yeah.
in bioarchive,
Yeah.
you see that right after 2017, 2018, boom, it spikes because now all of a sudden, and I started doing this. I'm like, oh, well, I'll just put this on. I got a
Yeah.
paper in
It
bioarchive.
kind of almost made it okay to talk about and like it kind of normalized it in a real and there, like and that policy was also very well publicized and talked about. So yeah, it had a
Well,
big
but there's also the study section grant review side. If I'm reviewing a proposal and an author says to me, I've got these manuscripts in prep or in
yeah, it's like show me the
under
fucking
review,
yeah.
and I'm like, I don't know what this means. What
Yeah.
does this
And you
mean?
always put the like, I'm submitting it to nature, even though it's
Right.
like,
And you're like, what does this mean? But now the fact that you can put bioarchive
yeah,
and I can see a citation, I say, okay, if an author thinks that a paper is far enough along that it's worthy of being shown to the public in bioarchive, meaning the author stands by what's in that paper
yeah,
to some extent
yeah,
prior to peer review, then I'm going to say, yes, that is absolutely evidence of productivity. And we all know how long that process of review takes.
yeah.
And then also for postdocs
Mm,
who are looking for jobs,
yeah,
right? Or graduate students who are looking for postdocs. Like the ability to actually put your work out there and have um, a review committee look at your evidence of productivity in the form of preprint before your manuscript
yeah,
is published while you're on the job market, that's huge. And so the combination of the NIH changing its behavior as well as a whole new kind of crop of postdocs 2017 2018 kind of entering
yeah.
academics and faculty positions has really changed the behavior around preprints. And we put everything in preprints now. Nothing goes
Yeah.
out unless it's been in a preprint
And
server.
now, comparing to your own postdoc transition to faculty, are you seeing with the postdocs who you interact with now and are reviewing and all that kind of stuff that it really is successfully and effectively, like you're saying, basically being used as part of your self promotion and
Yeah,
self whatever to get?
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, okay,
Yeah, it's cited. I mean, look what came out of the archives for preprints for COVID.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's kind of like, it's self-reinforcing,
yeah.
and so it can
Now,
help change
now, but
behavior.
after all of that, like kind of really accelerated preprints, and I don't know the numbers on this at all, but my sort of general 30,000 foot view sense was that the usage of preprints after, like today, right, basically is a lot more than Greenaway, or is that not? Or do you feel like they're still comparable in numbers, like in terms of things that are getting put on e-scholarship versus preprint servers? Or have
Yeah,
they
I
kind of
don't
like
really know the
moved into the
specific.
same
I
space?
mean, they're not necessarily overlapping because preprints are pre peer review,
Yeah.
and stuff that goes in e-scholarship is all post peer review.
With all post peer review?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's
Interesting.
the author's accepted manuscript.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So, but can
So
you can you use it as a preprint server, or do you not? Do
I
they only accept post review?
we don't I don't think that's part of it. No. That's
Okay.
not how it's kind of
Interesting.
eScholarship is the publishing platform for the University of California. They've got a bunch of journals as well as the repository for authors accepted manuscripts, as
Huh.
well as it also contains many links and versions of record, like the final published version of articles that are from open access, like native open access publications.
So is that so? Yeah, that's kind of always kind of. I haven't really gone deep on it, but I always was like, kind of felt weird that on preprint servers you couldn't just go like, and I guess it's a little. There's like legal issues with this, but just like putting extra like putting your like post reviewed content up on, and I think I actually may have done that with one of my articles I put. Yeah, actually, I should probably take that down. But
Yeah,
like,
that's not
yeah, I
really
mean,
the right
it's up
place for it.
on a preprint server. But yeah, but they've kind of yeah, because that's another area where I've sort of, like how do you push preprints to then move further? And I know they're doing some stuff with like, especially with bioarchive and MetaArchive, they've done a really good job with like trying to move towards, connecting in external review into them. But yeah, I guess I don't really have a question there. It's just kind of an area, an active
Yeah, no,
area.
preprints serve a very specific role,
Yeah.
and it's not to replace institutional repositories, which serve
Yeah.
another very specific role.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So they're all kind of like links in a chain,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We probably shouldn't get too bogged down
That's
on
all
that.
right.
Yeah.
I
Okay. So, but where you were headed before that was that change.
oh
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
so the idea that even though we were developing all these open access policies and institutions were doing it, and yet the world was still spending like $8 billion a year on subscriptions,
Mhm.
was just nuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I like 2016 or so, I convened with Annalisa Taylor, who's a scholarly communications officer at UCSF. She and I convened this kind of multi-institutional working group with folks from Harvard and MIT and Virginia and Toronto and Cal State and a bunch of UC campuses, and just kind of like a group to get together every month or so and just talk about ScholComm issues and ways that we could change it. The whole idea was to make it action oriented.
Uh-huh.
Um, and um, and so we had in that same year the UC system, UCSF, UC Davis, and UC Berkeley
Mhm.
signed on to this global initiative called OA 2020.
Mhm.
And the Max Planck Digital Library in Berlin had issued this white paper, which is considered to be a watershed event in kind of like the massive transformation that we're beginning to see towards gold open access, so to speak, to contrast green. And what the authors and Ralph Schimmer and some others did for that in that white paper was come up with this this kind of model where if you look at the amount of money that's currently in the world kind of ecosystem of scholarly communication, $8 billion a year. If you look at the number of articles that are published every year, it's about 2 billion or 2 million articles a year. And if you look at the average APC for gold open access, it's around 2,000. You do the math, you're coming in somewhere around $4 billion a year to pay to
Mhm.
publish everything open access. If we just took all the money in the subscription system, we'd have almost twice as much money as we need to publish all the work. If we basically took all the journals and said to the publishers, we'll give you the same amount of money, or we'll give you whatever money it takes to cover all these articles, if you just make it all open access, that there was enough money in the system to do that.
Yeah,
And
with this like wrench in there, which is like the way that this operates isn't necessarily like just that linear translation. It's always this, what can you get people to pay? And that's always where, as a company, what you're always pushing for is like, it actually doesn't matter what the cost to do something is. It's always about what can you get somebody to pay. And I
well,
feel
for
like
sure.
that's what's coming back to like throw a wrench in some of
But
this.
but it
Yeah,
was clear that the publishers were doing a really good job of getting people to pay what they wanted them to pay.
yeah,
Spending $8 billion a year on a product that really should only cost $4 billion a year.
yeah. That's true. Yeah, yeah.
If in fact even the $2,000 APC per unit cost was a representation of what the true value or how much it actually costs to do that. And there was a lot of evidence to show that it really only costs somewhere in the order of about $500
Mhm.
to
Per.
yeah, per unit when you talk about kind of editing, typesetting, indexing, that kind of stuff, even infrastructure, database, whatever. So even at $2,000 a unit cost was seemed generous, and that puts you at about 4 billion a year. And the world was spending 8 billion on subscriptions.
Yeah.
So just kind of as a conceptual framework, it made a lot of sense. And so we signed on to that. We UC signed on to that and got really involved. And it was coming in this long history of the Berlin Open Access meetings. And so I started going to those meetings in 2016 or something like that, and that allowed me to kind of get introduced to and start working with international community. There were lots of other folks from UC who went to that, and we just realized like we could do something at scale.
Yeah,
if we all work together. UC system has such a huge impact in North America. There's a few large consortia that have, a disproportionate share of the total publishing volume and spend in the United States and North America. And Europeans were going to handle this at the countrywide level. Germany was going to take on this problem. The Netherlands were taking on this problem. The UK was taking this problem at scale, at the level of funders, at the level of the entire country, and that we could do something equivalent in the UC system. So that was in 2016. So there's kind of like a lot of these things happening. And I remember I had a conversation at one point with Ivy Anderson, who was leading the California Digital Libraries negotiations with publishers. And she said to me, I don't think we can do this at the UC system, because as soon as we start cutting subscriptions or divesting from subscriptions, the UC, faculty, the librarians, the faculty, they would all just kind of revolt. And I said, well, what if we created kind of a list of principles and documents, or, our declaration of principles, and kind of framed the faculty perspective on this in a way that the library could kind of like.
So was that the impetus for the Researcher Bill of Rights?
Yeah. So that's kind of, I was like, okay. So I drafted, like I said, like a dozen of them, like 12 or so. The first of which was no copyright transfers, because that was the most important to me. But there were a few others that I went around with this multi-institutional working group that I talked about from these other institutions. I went to all these different academic Senate committees, and I more or less posed the question, if you could build a scholarly communication system from scratch, what would it look like? What would it look like on data, on citations, on rights, author rights, on how we pay for publishing or subscriptions, or no double dipping, paying for reading as well as paying for publishing? What about, non-disclosure agreements, like the fact that all of these license agreements, these subscription deals are hidden, and nobody knows what anyone's paying for, and everyone has different deals. Like, what if we opened all of that up? And so I got input from lots of different people, and I put together this list of 18 rights and principles. And I spent a whole year going, UCLAS passed that unanimously. And then I spent a whole year going through 8 or so academic Senate committees, as well as academic council, the Council on University Librarians, and SLASIAC, and getting endorsement. Got unanimous endorsement from all of those entities, Committee on Research, Capital, CAP, which is academic advancement, and so on, just basically getting everyone to agree that this was the way forward, so that we could empower the library.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. This like kind of really falls in this bucket of like, how can you like strategically use each of these components, this like triangulation of like power dynamics, to basically give people the courage to like do things that at the end of the day end up actually not blowing up in your face as much as you think.
Right. So here's the thing, like about, and there's a lot of grief out there about the APC system, and I totally get it. I don't think it's the right way to go. I honestly don't. But what I do see it as is a transitional mechanism by which we get from one steady state to another. And as I went around to all these Senate committees over the years, the one thing that I learned is that faculty love their journals, right? They're members of professional societies, these journals, and oftentimes are hundreds of years old. There's history. Their advisors published in these journals, and their advisors, and like we're all really into genealogy and lineage in academia. There's a canon of literature, of journals, and all of these titles that people just don't want. Yes, there are many opportunities to publish in open access journals, native new open access journals, But for the vast majority of disciplines, the vast majority of faculty researchers, they don't want to switch. They're comfortable with the editors. They know the academic editors on the boards. They know the peer review system. They understand what it takes to get into these different journals. They like the system of rewards and credits and how it advances careers. So the beauty, from my point of view, of taking subscription money, the OA 2020 strategy, and using it to pay for publishing is that you can take the old system and destroy it. We can destroy subscriptions, and keep the canon of journals, allow authors to continue to use the systems of peer review and reward and everything that they're accustomed to, and support their society journals, allow mechanisms of prestige to continue the way that they work with impact and so on. But at the same time that we're dismantling subscriptions, we're creating an ecosystem based on open. Okay, so that's that second leg of the stool that I was talking about, right? And by doing that, you've now created as a default state open. Okay, so what does that do? It allows, in the end, universities, institutions, funders to follow their authors wherever their authors want to publish. Okay, they can follow the money, right? Or the money follows the author. So if a whole discipline decides that Elsevier's lingua is a terrible system for publishing and too expensive and they don't want to do it, or it's not open, then they can leave en masse and they can start Glossa. Right. And they, you see this, you see editorial boards resigning from commercial publishers. But that can only happen in a system where now authors are confronted with price, where they have to see how much something actually costs. One of the most valuable lessons I learned about author behavior, researcher behavior more broadly, is when I would go and I would say to them, we're paying all these subscriptions, or, publishers are making all this kind of money. And the authors would say, the faculty would say, well, I don't pay for anything. I just go online and I download it for free. I'm like, well, where do you download it from? They're like, oh, I download it from the library website. I'm like, well, who pays for that? This is how much we pay. We pay $40 million a year to get access to that content. So, but now you put a price in front of an author, and it changes author behavior. And at scale, all of a sudden authors can say, like, this is ridiculous. Why am I paying $10,000 to publish in this journal? My society does all the work. We publish it, we peer review it, we kind of give the publisher, a role at the end, but we could take all this in-house, especially when there are academic presses that are doing this for $250, $500 a unit. So to me, yes, there's a lot of opposition to APCs, and I get it. And I think it's a transitional model. It's a way that we get from point A without disrupting the whole system, because the only way to change author behavior, from my point of view, is to integrate it into the existing workflow in the most seamless, kind of straightforward way. And so once you do that, now open becomes the default, authors retaining their rights becomes the default, and now the issue is about money again. And once you start
but just one clarifying question. So the way that OA 2020, or just the transformative agreements help that transition, is basically by allowing a journal to switch over to this APC model while basically converting the subscriptions to the APC cost, so that they're not immediately hit in the face with that paying to publish. But then once they hit their limit or whatever, then it's kind of slowly introduces that cost of the APCs, as opposed to like throwing in their face immediately. Is that kind of how it helps that transition?
And the countries and the institutions and the entities that signed on to OA 2020, we all agreed that it would be revenue neutral. It would be cost neutral, revenue neutral, so that the publishers would more or less continue to get their same revenue. The universities, the institutions, the countries would spend more or less the same on, at scale. There's kind of adjustments that are being made, but it's so that we can transition all the existing journals. We can model good behavior around open and around author rights. And now all of a sudden everyone's like, okay, we can't go back. We'll never go back to subscriptions. But is this the best way to get our work out there? And guess what? We start to see all kinds of infrastructure being built. We start to see all kinds of academic institutions encouraging, enticing, supporting scholarly societies who want to come back to academia. We start to see the birth of all kinds of diamond open access, which is supported by philanthropy and funders and other mechanisms where there are no author-facing fees. And we're going to start to see much more of that. We're going to see, I'm confident, this shift because of the money, the spend, and that fact that authors are seeing a lot of this, and institutions have to pay when authors don't have money. But it breaks like the stranglehold that was keeping us from making progress for so long was the stranglehold of the subscription system and the transfer of copyright.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Having that price tag in any way, shape, or form in front of authors' eyes is incredibly helpful because it was hidden before. And like you said, oh yeah, I just go to the website and I download it for free. Like you just literally thought it was free. There was no concept of the budget that was going into this. So just, having it thrown in people's faces is helpful. Yeah. No matter where it goes from there, it's basically a fire that will lead somewhere. Okay, we have like 10 minutes left. So we're clearly not going to get to all of the, I had a goal of us completely solving all these problems in an hour, but you have to go right at 2:20, right?
2:20 was like with a bio break. I have to be online at 2:30.
Okay, yeah, no, you should be able to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water. So maybe the last like 5-10 minutes here, just try to step back like a lot. You kind of just like drift up into the clouds a little bit. Obviously this is a hand-to-hand combat in terms of like, getting to next year and like slowly like affecting change here. But if you kind of drift back and like think about where we're kind of headed, like what, like think of like almost at a generational level, like how like in a super idealistic, like let go of some of the constraints of like, like user behavior and all this stuff. And like thinking on the scale of like decades to like, 100 years, like building up this infrastructure that we're going to feel really confident in handing off to the next generation of scientists. Where does your head go with that? Because part of my frustration, and I think I might just be off here. I think I might need to like there's all, it's like this, Patrick, you said like this links in a chain, and I see how we're kind of solving these problems, but I also have this like almost like probably bad idiosyncratic like engineering impulse to like what is this infrastructure? How do we get to like a slightly more pure infrastructure where it's like just really robust and reliable? That's this like, could get at like what is a digital library kind of thing. And maybe that's a bad way of looking at it, because maybe the patchwork is robust and that's where you gain strength from. But like, where does your mind go when you're thinking about like, accessing scientific articles like in the moment, from the past, like the articles that in 100 years people are going to be wanting to access? Like where does your head go when you kind of like give yourself more freedom of like power, like if you could like make researchers behave in a certain way, if you could just set policy like as God kind of situation? Like where's your more idealistic purist kind of heart go with?
Well, I mean, okay, I think first of all, we have to realize that the system that we have now has been around for what, like 800 years or something like that. Like we were talking about the article, we were talking about the journal, we're talking about peer review, we're talking about professional societies, and all of those things in many ways they work, right? Professional societies work really well because you get like-minded individuals to come together and think about and talk about problems and have a critical mass exchange of ideas and so on. Journals work really well on some level because they're collections of content that's been prepared for easier digestion than if you had to go out and find it all on your own. I mean, maybe there are better discovery tools, but those article filters that send me stuff every month or whatever, it's like, okay, that's fine. But I think we can do better than that, so collections, journals, however you want to do it. But I still think the functional unit that is optimal for humans in terms of engagement, in terms of academics and inquiry, is the article. And so the question is, how can we produce art if that's going to be the unit moving forward? Then and by the way, that's maybe an overstatement. Like I used the song analogy earlier. Like I really like listening to songs. 3 or 4 minutes is like a good thing. I'm a musician, I play in a band, I write music. A song, 3-4 minute song, that's a good thing. You engage, you tell a story, you have an experience, versus like getting into an elevator and listening to continuous, or an airport, continuous
Mhm.
nonstop music. Like those are different experiences.
Yeah.
So, maybe a continuous feed of information and data coming out
Well, I
without being
guess,
parsed.
but I guess what I'm getting at is less of the like. I mean, so I have like kind of two parts of my brain. Like one part is yeah, like just the workflow and the consumption and like that kind of stuff. That to me is very. It's much more like product, services, infrastructure, and like immediate usage of it.
Sure.
But where I'm kind of trying to dig deeper is like the long term storage of that. Like, is that like because right now I feel like though that experience is being leveraged to like sequester and to control that content right now, and less so more on subscription, less so on the APC
Yeah.
side. But like, yeah, so like I don't know.
Well, okay, assuming that subscriptions die, which is what we're trying to do, is to kill
Yeah,
subscriptions, and that
yeah,
all human knowledge is freely available online and is being searched by robots, and we're more or less just sitting on our couches with a skull cap on a
yeah,
feeding tube plugged into the wall, and all this information is being downloaded to our brains,
yeah,
and you don't have to do anything. You just have to have an idea, and you pop your idea into the feeding tube, and it goes out and it pulls other ideas out of the kind
yeah,
of morass. um, you know, like I think there's definitely going to be still going to be a need for curation, like really sophisticated curation tools to match interests and subject
yeah,
matter and stuff like that. There's going to absolutely be a need for all kinds of new infrastructure. I mean, when you think about how much brain power and intellectual capital exists in academia, harnessing that in the publishing ecosystem, not just in generating the publications, but like in the peer review and the editing, but actually in the production. That's why I'm really excited about a lot of these efforts to like build infrastructure for academia. This next generation library project that
yeah.
I'm
I'm really bummed.
advising on.
I mentioned
Yeah, no,
a
I mean
whole like
that's
30 minutes on that. We'll do
that's
it.
okay. We'll come back to that, but like
Yeah,
that when I got involved, it was being run by Kristen Rattan and Catherine Mitchell. So Kristen and I met at PLOS. I was at PLOS for a year or so, consulting with them. And then Catherine I've worked with for a long time at the CDL, and Catherine Skinner, who was at Educopia. And I feel like, that kind of effort where there's synergy among all different kinds of stakeholders to build infrastructure for academic publishing. That's where I see the next 50
yeah,
years, 100 years of work. Is like we don't really need commercial publishers. We
yeah,
really don't on any meaningful level. What we need is peer review, and we need editing, and we need a system of rewards and like badging papers that are we cream rises, and we need to be able to identify the articles that stand out, their breakthrough, whatever they are. And the publishers, they're making a lot of money off of free labor of academics. And it's like, I get it when it was print and bound volumes and distribution and all kinds of stuff, that made sense. But right now, at this day and age, like, I think we're ready to move on.
yeah,
And you know, some of them are really good people, and they're sincere, and they believe they're adding a lot of value to publishing. But that same value can be added by academics in-house, and we don't really need brands, and we don't really need big commercial publishers to tell you that something is valuable. The community can assess that and make those decisions on their own, independent of
mhm,
a big name brand.
yeah, yeah,
But beyond that, like I don't really know what 100 years from now would it look
yeah,
like, but
yeah,
I hope it'll be quite distinct from what we're doing right now.
yeah. Yeah, and I do. I mean, I do kind of see journals continuing to have a pretty strong hold on like the immediate effects of an article. So like prestige, visibility. But if you can effectively disentangle that from the handling of the content and the preservation. So like I kind of like this concept of you preprint first, and then you're just like what eLife is doing, and then you're kind of just really
Sure.
disambiguating those two. And I think the next generation library publishing, like if those kind of get built up to the point where like when we were first transitioning to internet, like that would have been great if that was like our first step, is you built that up, and like the like academic control of
Yeah.
the infrastructure was like the backbone, and then the journals were just doing like, oh hey, we're getting people to pay for this like publicity. Like that's a much better place, because then they can just do whatever they want. It's not like directly like affecting any of the stuff that
Sure.
authors are doing. And
Absolutely.
even if it's
No,
open access, like I get nervous about like them it being on their servers. Like we also need like the infrastructure of the servers that are,
yeah.
if a company goes down, that and that is happening, but it seems a little patchy right now. So I'm excited about like the next generation library publishing, things like that.
No, for sure. But and let me be really clear about journals. Like I think journals do a terrible job in some things and a really good job in others. The
Yeah, yeah,
journal as kind of a as a unit. Like
yeah,
journals are terrible when they serve as proxies for quality, right?
yeah, yeah,
That's like the worst thing that happens
yeah,
in every aspect of academia in terms of promotion and visibility and all the other stuff. Like, you know, if a paper, there's a lot of garbage in high prestige journals because there is a Nobel laureate as a senior author, for example. Nothing against the Nobel laureates, but like
yeah,
a lot journals, big journals are attracted to authors because of high citations and so on, not necessarily high quality work
mm-hmm.
all the time. So there's a lot of garbage in prestige journals. There's a lot of really good stuff in journals that, a giant mega journal that no one would consider prestigious might have also Nobel laureates publishing in it, or other really high quality work. So when a journal serves as a proxy for quality, that's
Yeah,
a really bad thing. But when a journal plays a role in helping readers
curate.
explore, yeah, curate a literature, a complicated literature, or or having confidence, having a society have a voice, have a place where a society can put its work. I mean, that's when journals are at their best,
Mm-hmm.
but they're at their worst when they serve as kind of some false metric for success or for visibility or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, last
All right,
favor. Can
man.
you put me on your little whiteboard and then check me off?
I should put you up there.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm important enough to get on there, but I.
No, you're important.
Yeah.
Awesome
All
talking to
right,
you,
this is
man.
awesome. Thanks so much, and yeah, we'll be in touch.
All right, take it easy.
All right, see you, man. Bye.
Yeah.